Okay, I need you back in your seat.
Oh, I got a first one. Yeah.
Files. Alright, and then numbers. Sorry, 1 through 5, I need you to hold on your hand or hands. Which numbers you would like to go over the most?
1 and 2.
Just hold up numbers,
1 and 2.
hold up numbers.
Yeah, one was easier.
The number 3 is easy.
So I'm gonna go with majority, so I need to see everyone's pick numbers that they want to do, see.
Wait, I learned these.
Let's do this. If you were a 1, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. If you were a 2, raise your hand. 3, 4, 5. Were there any 3s? 4s? And 5s? So let's do. We'll do 3 this time. We'll do 1, 2, and 4.
Like,
So these will be the ones that you should get no matter what. These are like 3 points for you, so make sure you have all of the work and the answer written on your answer sheet. Evaluate the expression. You're putting 9 and -2 into these. So we'll have 9 minus 5 times -2 squared. And then order of operation, we would square this first. Remember what we talked about the other day with this? This is really -2 times -2, so it should be a positive. Multiply. And then subtract. If you got -11, good job. If you didn't, find where you made your mistake, fix it. Make sure you have all of that work and the answer written in that box. If on your answer sheet, a box is ever too small, you want to switch it, you're welcome to do that. Okay, I said 1, 2, 4. So number 2, using the order of operations, what we would do first is grouping. Add these 2 together. And then we can do our exponents, so we have 2 of them. 24 minus 64 plus 4 times 8. Multiply 4 and 8. And then add all 3 of those together, or subtract the first 2, add the 32. So this should be -40 plus 32, so -8. So don't second guess yourself. That is one big issue I always see, that we think it's this, but then we change because this couldn't be right. Right, questions about those 2? Right, and then number 4, 2 less than the product of -4 and, so this, it's a lot going on, for -4 and the sum of a number and 3. Right, 1 step at a time. 2 less than, we know we're subtracting, we know the 2 goes to the end. The product of, so we are multiplying -4 and all of this. And then we're adding a number and 3. So it should look something like this. -4 outside of parentheses, x plus 3 or whatever variable you chose, and then -2 at the end. Questions on number 4? So the little half sheet, if you didn't write on them, you can give those back, not right now. But if you did, you can either keep them or recycle them, not right now. I need to give out reviews. Gabriella, do you want to sit there so you can see this board either or whichever. Okay, so today we're gonna review for your quiz on Friday. Friday, you are going to take your quiz, and then, I'm trying to see this board, but you're hard to see. Tuesday, we're gonna go over that quiz, and then you're gonna take your test. That's how that's going to work moving forward. And then the day after that will be a flex day, so if you need to finish your test, or if you finished it and I had time to grade it, then you'll have time to do retake stuff, if need be, all those things. But today, we're gonna go through this first section together, and then everything after that will be whatever questions you choose that you wanna go over, you wanna see, all those things. Alright, so we have to label which of these operations go with these words. So sum is which one? Add. Product is which one?
Multiplication.
So I'm just gonna put a dot. Decrease by. Subtract. Quotient. Division, so I'm gonna actually put the division sign, but remember when we write it, we would have to use it. Increase by. Addition. Difference. Subtraction. More than. Addition. Less than. Subtract, and twice something. So of course, there are more words than that. We talked about a bunch previously. If you need a reminder, you can pull those notes out. But we want to, in this first section, write a verbal expression. So write in words these algebraic expressions. Which of these from this section 10 through 19 do we want to see, do go over, have questions about? No. So we can pick ones that you have, but we're not going to do every single problem on this review. It would take way. There we go. 10. Okay. So we'll start at 10. A and B are multiplying to each other. So give me a word that means to multiply. We've heard different things. I heard times and something else. Twice. Twice would only work if you had 2 times. But we can make this simple A times B. If you want to make it more complex and say a number times a different number, number A times a different number B, you can do all of those things. I'm just writing the most basic thing. Any others in this section? 17. All right, so we have a couple things going on here. We have 1/2, and 1/2 is being multiplied to everything. So we have to think of how we could word that. And then we are adding. So first, let's start off with how could we say 1/2 is being multiplied to everything?
1/2 times the product of, or the sum of.
There we go. So 1/2 times the sum of. Because that means 1/2 is being multiplied to everything that is being added. And then because we have the sum of, we can just say X and Y. That happens. Sure. Right, 16, what operation is happening here? Division. So we can say, give me a word that would mean to divide.
Over.
Sure, that would work. The likelihood of you seeing over is low, but you could use it and I would accept it. If you said the quotient of X and Y, that would work. X divided by Y, all of those would work. Right, any others in that section? Sure. So in 13, there's only one thing happening here. It's being raised to the 3rd power. So you can either say M raised to the third power, or m cubed. And that would work. Or the number 12, sure. So it's twice a number, we could say twice x, any of those would work. You could say twice a number x if you want to specify. Any others in that section? Next section. Now we are taking the words and making them into math, translating them into algebraic expressions. Which of those do you want to see you go over and have questions about? Yeah, 31 to 31. Kimberly, Raymond. All right, twice a number, so we know we're multiplying by 2. Increase by, that would be adding. 3 times, so kind of the same as twice, but we're actually multiplying by 3, the number. Because a number, the number, it doesn't say a different number, whatever variable we choose, we're gonna use the same one for both. So 2 times a number, someone give me a variable. Or plus 3 times that same number. If we were simplifying, we would combine like terms, but we are not doing that, so we would just leave it as is. Other ones in this section,
29.
29, okay, 27. Right, we'll do 27 then 29. 27, 1/2 the product of x and y. So we know we have this 1/2. We know it's being multiplied to the product of. Sorry. The product of these two things are being multiplied, x and y. So we could write this as 1/2 and then in parentheses x, y. Remember, you don't need the dot. Right now, this quiz, this test, if you put that, it's okay, but next unit, we want to stop doing that completely unless absolutely necessary. Okay, 29, I'm gonna move, erasing this outside on. Twice, so we're multiplying again by 2. The product of, and it tells us the product of A and B. A and B are multiplying together, so we're gonna put 2 outside of A and B. Other questions in that section?
Can you do 33?
33. Alright, for 33, 3 times, you know, we're multiplying the sum of, so that would be adding, and A and B are what's being added together. So this would kind of look like 27, 29, except on the inside, we are adding A. That's actually written. Right, 7 more than the cube of a number. So this is something to the third power. I'm gonna go with this to the third power. So 7 plus, someone give me a variable,
X.
or x cubed. So make sure that you're not confusing cube and cube root, square and square root. It would say root if you needed the simple.
You do 28.
So the product of twice A and B, similar to 29, but a little different, because now all of this is what you're multiplying together, but twice is specifically multiplying A. So I'm gonna put two A in parentheses and B outside of it. Or you can put the B in parentheses with two A not in parentheses, either or. That's
Can you do that too?
the sum of 3 times A and B, similar to 33, but a little different. So the sum of, this is what we're adding together, but we are multiplying 3 and A and then adding B. So 3A, plus. So notice the differences between 28, 29, 32, 33, there are slightly different. Any others in this section before we move on?
Maybe 35.
The cube of, so that means everything after those words is gonna be raised to the third power. The sum of everything after those words are going to be, let's do that. We're going to be added together. So we have in parentheses. Outside of that parentheses will be to the third power. On the inside, we have A plus. Is that the same as 33? Not one. The cube of.
Doesn't 34 just not have parentheses?
Cube of A plus B. The cube of the sum of A plus B. Oh, got it. This part goes together. The cube of A plus B. The difference is, one is being cubed to everything. The first one is just being cubed to just A. Go on to the next page. Right, so this is much like what we did when we were modeling, except they have changed the model a little bit. The bigger squares are still x squares, but now the rectangles are x, y, and the small squares are y squared. So whatever key you have, always use that key. And because we are now drawing, they're drawn, negatives are represented as it being shaded. Are there any questions on this page we want to see do go over a couple of spots? Remember, you have the key, you can look at it. How many x squared do we have? Three. 3x squared. How many xy do we have? 4, and they're negative, so negative 4xy. We don't have any small squares, so we would not put any y squared at all. This would be our. That's what the keys are. So we're just doing whatever the keys are. Other questions on this page?
Do number 1.
1, 4. For number 1, how many x squares do we have? How many xy's?
2.
2, and they're negative. And then how many y squareds? 3. So in this case, this is highest exponent, but also ABC order mixed in together. If you switch this around and did this, I would accept this. You may not see it anywhere like that, but I would accept that for this quiz this time. Great. Other questions on this page? Make a Can you do number 5? How many x squared do you have?
-2.
-2. How many xy's? 1, so you can just put plus xy, or you can put the 1 in front, either or, doesn't matter. How many y squareds? 3 and a negative. Go on to the next page. Now this has switched. So now you're given the expression and we have to draw in the algebra tiles. Any of those you want to see do go over 3. The key is still the same. So if we have 4x squareds, what are we drawing? 4 bigger boxes, yes. I'm going to move it. No, I'm saying no. But that's okay. 3xy, what are we drawing? 3 rectangles that are not filled in. And then negative y squared, how many and what are we drawing? 1 small. Any others? So this is strictly modeling, but if we were simplifying using that. Any others on this page we want to see and go over? Okay, number 5, how many x squared are we gonna draw?
3.
3. That's not the question I meant to ask, but yeah. Negative 4xy, what are we drawing? Rectangles that are shaded. Right. And then 5y squared, what are we drawing? That's it.
5 small square.
Shaded or unshaded?
Shaded.
Other questions on this page? Move on to the next. So modeling was a part of simplifying. We're still in simplifying. This first page is really just combining like terms. Questions on any of these? One. Right. In these, you don't actually need to show this work, but I'm going to write out what you would do. Here, these are all like terms. You have to remember there's an invisible 1 in front of all of them. So you would be combining every single one. Adding or subtracting 1 minus 7 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. Combining all those together. Do that till you get -3. And then make sure you put X behind it. So you would not need to show me this part. You could add these all up in your head in the calculator and then get that -3. Other questions? Right? What are the like terms here? -3, -7. 7 and -10. So this would be ABC order. Excuse me, and then P, then the 8 at the end. And when we combine them, we would get what? -3n. The P's, when we combine them, we would get E, bring down the E. Other questions on this page? Right, same thing. What are our like terms here? I heard 8n,
7 and 6.
7n, 6n. The T and the 3 don't have a like term. So combine these, what would we get?
21.
21 and bring down -10t and then bring down the +3. Next page. Any questions on this page? So this page is more distributing, combining like terms, fractions with distributing, combining like terms, all of them. Any others? We'll do 9 and then go back to 3. Right, just because it's a fraction, don't let that trip you up. It's the same thing. We're still going to distribute, so 1/3 to the 24x and the -18y, and the -1/4 to the 16x and the -36y. You could multiply 1/3 and 24, 1/3 and -18, -1/4 and 16, -1/4 and -36. Or because this is a fraction where the numerator is 1, you can think about this as dividing 24 by 3, -18 by 3, 16 by -4, -36 by -4. So you choose. And then tell me what those new terms would be.
Eight X minus 9y minus 4x minus 9y.
So we'll check that one. And then this, you're close, this should be plus 9y,
Oh,
because
6.
we have the two negatives, yes. Okay, then combine your like terms, we have x's, we have y's. What would our final result be?
4x plus 3y
So it should be positive 4x and what was that last one?
plus 3y.
So make sure that you're double checking your math, be careful with those things. Questions on that one before we do 3? Okay, this one. We need to multiply the -5 to the 3, bring everything else down. And then combine like terms of it. So when we combine these two, what would we get? So be careful, we're not multiplying here, they are just combining like terms of negatives. Also make sure that you're not doing anything with this exponent. The exponent goes with the x, not with the 3. Great, other questions on this page? Yes, Nikhil. 7. Right. So here, if we had like terms inside these parentheses, we could do something with that, but in this case, we do not. So we're just going to distribute. -18a plus 54 minus 54a squared. Then don't forget that -7a outside. And then we're going to rearrange and combine like terms in it. So what would come first? So this one is squared, but these are the like terms. So we can combine those, and when we reorder them, which one will come first? The one that's squared. Okay, combine those from which you get. -25, a, and then plus 50. Other questions? -54a squared minus 25a plus 54. Okay, so we've done translating, we've done simplifying, next is evaluating. We can go on to the next page. So, can you make a fast part? So this is very much like what we did the other day. With evaluating, which of these do we have questions on once we go over anything like that? Eleven. Right, number 10, we have 2 variables. We're gonna put them into both. This is 2 times the cube root, so if you wanna put in those parentheses, you're more than welcome to. So 2 times the cube root of 64 minus 2 times. Order of operations, what are we doing first? Which one? The cube root, so find the cube root of 64. What times what times what, it has to be the same number, would multiply to get 64. 4. I could also multiply these at the same time, and then multiply these, or you could wait, multiply them here, does not matter. To get a final answer of. Now, I did not do this the other day, but I'm gonna show you how you do this in the calculator. So we could do one of 2 things, either type this in exactly as we have it with the numbers. reset your calculator if you haven't, second plus 712. And then I would put in 2. And then the cube root, so math 4. 64. Make sure you go to the right to get out of it. Minus 2. And then in parentheses, 2. And we should get the same thing. So that's one way you can check yourself in the calculator. The other is to kind of use the slider method we were doing on Desmos, but on here. So in order to do this, you would need to store 64 as X and store 2 as Y. Let me show you how to do that. You can type in 64. And then this STO button above on. Make sure everyone's doing this part. And then I want that to be X, so I'm gonna hit X. And then enter. And it won't look like anything happened, but what it did was put 64 in for X. I'm gonna do the same thing for Y. So I need Y to be 2, so 2 STO, but I have to find Y. It's in green. So I have to hit alpha and then 1. And then enter. Then I can retype that, but with variables. 2 math 4. X come out. Minus 2 alpha 1. You would get this one. So whichever method you like better, storing the variables and then doing it like this, or just putting the numbers in, is completely up to you. Questions about calculator, doing that? I will show that more. Okay, so for 11, same thing, we have 2 different variables, put those in. So 4 times A, so 4, minus 3 times 6. Multiply those first. And subtract. And then at the end, make sure there's nothing else left to do, so you don't need the parentheses, but you do need to make it positive. And then if you are double checking this with the numbers in the calculator, alpha window will give you your absolute value. So the first one, and then you can just put everything in. Other evaluating questions. Yes. Okay, so 5 and 6. 5 first. The cube root of 8 minus 3. So figure out what the cube root is first. What times what will give you 8? And then when we subtract, our final answer would be negative. Okay, I'm not gonna double check that in the calculator, but you are welcome to. And then the last one, -4/3 times 12 minus 2. Go ahead and multiply -4/3 and 12. And then subtract. Do we have any other evaluating? Math. Okay. So 3 times 1/2 squared plus 1. What would we do first? That's 1. This would become 1/4. You're multiplying 1/2 times 1/2, not doubling it. And then multiply 3 times 1/4. And then adding those two. Add those two, tell me what you get. As a fraction. Put it in as a fraction.
1/3.
And not a mixed number, improper sign.
7/4.
7. There we go. I misspoke earlier. This unit, this quiz, this test, we're doing a review day and then quiz day, go over quiz and then test day. But moving forward, it will be review and then quiz, go over quiz, then test. So that we have more time to do other things. But then the flex day will still be after that. Right, do we have any other questions before I explain what you're doing next? As the answer. So this can't be the. Is that really? If you were trying to do that by hand. This would be over 1. You would have to get these to be the same denominator. By multiplying it by 4, we would also have to multiply this by 4. And then add in. So today. You can do one of the following and then, this afterwards. So you can keep working in the review packet if you so choose, if you feel like you need more practice, want to do more practice, if you want additional practice from throughout the unit, I can bring those back out. Slash, if you've not done this week's Delta Math on evaluating or previous Delta Math, you can be working on that. You're working on one of those 2 things and then in a bit, I'll have you put calculators and stuff up. Right, you can work together, you can move around.